Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon. Up there, we do have a lot of fun stuff on top of the traceables and reference photos, like that of access to the polls, my collection of ebooks, our private Facebook group, bonus lessons. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. We're going to begin on an 11 by 14 inch black canvas, and I'm going to start with a 1 inch flat-headed brush. Now, before I get started, I am going to dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water. This is going to help condense the bristles, but also ensure that our paint stays wet for a longer period of time. That noted, I do wipe off the excess water, that way we don't thin our paint too much. So we'll start by grabbing quite a bit of our ultramarine blue and then about half that in Mars black. We'll mix the two together thoroughly and grab about a quarter of that in titanium white. So the majority of the mixture here is blue, however it's very desaturated because the titanium white and Mars black are quite thick. That said, I'm now switching over to a 1/2 inch flat-headed brush with fairly stiff bristles, as you can see, and I'm also peeling them back so that the brush looks a little bit disheveled for our next step. With that, for our next step, we are hopping back into the palette. I'm adding the smallest amount of paint just to the tips of our bristles, and then I'm going into the canvas with a tapping motion. Now, I'm trying to apply a very little amount of pressure. I'm rotating my brush so that I get a different mark on the canvas each time, and I'm also rotating said brush in the air rather than when it's actually on the canvas so that I don't get a bit of a swirl effect on there. But essentially, I want hundreds of little sharp implications of this nice blue in the sky, clusters of stars. We're going to build up the layers through a real process, but this is very much the first one. And as you can see, I'm working for the most part around my tree branches, around my clusters of foliage. However, I do opt to go over quite a lot of them as well, simply because we can always go back and redraw them, repaint them. And I do want to ensure that I have a nice full sky, that it doesn't end up being too small. And so here I'm just working my way out, continuing that process, and really just attempting to get fairly nice coverage. I'm even going back over previously applied areas as well, just to ensure that there isn't an area that's a little bit too dark. Though, I would like to note, while this lesson will be real time, it will also have a variety of different views. I like to show different portions of the painting from farther back, that way you get to see it as more of a cohesive unit. But I also like to show it very up close, that way you can see all of our different textures and the markings at, a really intimate level. But with that, here you can see we are continuing to work through it. Some of these taps are a bit sharper than others, and that diversity is going to look nice later down the road. So don't worry if it isn't hyper consistent, because it really doesn't have to be, especially at this stage. With that, here is the same canvas from a bit of a different angle, and you can really see just how reflective the paint can be if you're standing on the wrong side of it. So this is just a very early reminder to be aware of how you're positioning yourself around that canvas, and that it really can have a fairly big impact on the final rendering of the painting, because at some angles you can see it properly, and others you can't really articulate the colors naturally, right? So here is just an example of not seeing that color at all and just a reflection because of not the best angle. But with that, we are going to head back over to our palette. We'll grab quite a lot of that ultramarine blue. We'll grab significantly less of our Mars black. This time it's about a quarter. We'll still go with a quarter of that titanium white, again in relation to that blue, and you can see that this mixture here is quite a bit brighter than our previous one. However, I think it might be a little too bright, so I work in some additional Mars black. I want to slowly brighten these layers, but not by a great amount. That way I have more room to grow and more layers to add, building additional depth within the sky and the stars. But once I have that, I do want to make sure that the canvas is fully dry to the touch, so we do a little touch test, and then we head back in, generally in the center-ish area, because that's really where I want the majority of the light, the detail, the really prominent shining stars to be. And I'm doing that because the eye innately goes to the brightest point of any piece. So if you want the viewer's eye subconsciously to go to and stay in the middle of your painting rather than kind of wandering off, you generally want your brightest subjects to be more so in the center. And we're also going to be working with some draping foliage over on the sides later in the painting. So this is really our opportunity to get that detail in. However, I am working in a bit of a diagonal line kind of in that central area. It moves upwards, it's vertical, but it also leans to the left just to make it a little bit more dynamic. You can have it working straight up if you'd like to, but I did opt to kind of add just that extra little flair to it. With that, here again, nice and close, just so you can see that I'm not covering the entirety of the sky yet. Again, I'm trying to leave some openings so you can see that darker blue from the initial application. That way, again, we are building those layers. There's more variance, and I think that this is looking quite nice at this point. It's also important to recognize that when the paint dries, it will look a lot more flat like mine does right now. That is going to happen to all of us. It's going to be less saturated, it's going to have less contrast, and that's simply because the pigment isn't wet and therefore reflective anymore. But that's okay because it gives us more room to build, and that's exactly what we're going to do with this next mixture. I'm mixing it right beside our initial pigment. That way I can kind of compare and contrast, but I'm looking for something that's slightly brighter that I can slowly build on top of. Now, I did find myself with something that was far too bright, significantly more titanium white than there should have been, so I initially darkened it with a little bit of blue to give it some additional saturation, and then I decided, you know what, we do need to add in the Mars black as well. So I opt for that. We get a fairly decent mixture. It's barely brighter. Switch back to that 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, and I go back in around that middle area of the canvas, working predominantly vertically, but with a little bit of an angle. And we don't really get that much application with this because we're not picking up that much paint, but that's okay because it gives us more time to really think about what we're doing, if we like it, and if we want to alter it in any way, right? So from there, I go back to the palette, I make it slightly brighter, as we will continue to do, and now I can go back in with a slightly adjusted pigment that is going to pop to a greater degree, but it's still not a pure white. It's still actually quite far from that, and that means we can still continue to build. Now, for this application, as you can see, I apply it initially closer to the middle of the canvas, and then I slowly work my way via taps to the left-hand side, allowing that pigment to dissipate. And I do this very purposefully so that we get a little bit of a glow situation going on. We have a, almost hard line that faces the right hand side of the canvas, but then on the left hand side it's more of this gradual transition where this tapping effect gets darker and more subdued, again the farther to the left we move, and this does give us a really nice element of depth that allows us to spread out that light a little bit so that it's not hyper focused. I'm also randomly tapping it once dissipated in other corners to, again, just create smaller pieces of interest, but nothing too dominant. I wouldn't want to go over to the left corner after just picking up paint and tap that on. That area is more reserved for once we've got the majority of the paint off around the middle of the canvas. But you can see that I am still working to the left, and I'm trying to keep the right hand side a bit darker. That way I have more room to play with detail in the very near future. But here you can see I have almost no paint left on my brush, and with that we are going to head back to our palette. So here, using that 1 inch flat-headed brush to do our blending, because it is fantastic at blending, it can just pick up and move so much paint very consistently. But once I have something a little bit brighter, something that I do feel comfortable with, I switch back to that 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, go back to that center area, and just continue to build via that tapping motion. I think it's also really worth noting that most of our brushes we want to be damp. We want to continuously clean our brushes, but this is one we want to avoid as long as we can, because the more dry it is, the more randomized the bristles will be. They won't condense together. So I do want to keep it very dry, and when I do feel like that paint is about to fully dry on it, then I will wash it just to ensure that the brush remains okay, and after that I will dry it very, very thoroughly. But here, again, going back, adding to those highlights. I know it's I know it's a little repetitive, but that is acrylic painting. That is one of the things I love about acrylic painting. It's so many opportunities to fix things, to make them better, to build on them, to make decisions mid-painting, right? If you're working with oils in a lot of scenarios, because they dry so slowly, you need to go in with the correct thought. Otherwise, you're waiting a couple of days, maybe even a week, before you can go in and add or change things. Where with acrylics, you go in, you try something, and oh, maybe you like it, maybe you don't. But regardless, in 10 minutes, you can go back and you can do another layer and play with it. And that's really what I'm doing here. I am purposefully not going in with anything too saturated or with too bright of a value initially, just so that I have more room to play and make decisions later on, which ends up working really well. I initially only wanted to do that kind of one larger vertical piece and then that one smaller one, but through this I realized that, you know what, I actually want to do a lot more in this guy. I want to expand, and as you saw in the thumbnail, that is something we end up doing. So friendly reminder, just don't try not to get frustrated with the amount of layering. It really is a great opportunity to learn and make changes and really perfect your craft, your application style. So here, going in with something a lot closer to titanium white. It's not quite titanium white just yet, and that's something I do want to avoid. I don't recommend using a pure titanium white on your canvas, just because it can't change in value, and therefore it's a very firm ceiling as to how much contrast a certain area can have, and it's often too much. So, we're still going in with a bit of a grayish white, a little bit of blue in there, of course, trying to keep the pigment a bit more cool, but I think it's working really well. We're starting to randomize the applications out towards the right-hand side again before committing to the larger amount, but while still looking quite rough, we are definitely off to a good start. Here we have a bit of a close-up where you can see really getting into the details, me not trying to connect all of the vertical pieces and then start, kind of working laterally, vertically at the same time. That way we do keep that more randomized element in it. And here, just through this randomized tapping, I'm starting to find form on that right hand side, and it's starting to inspire me to really expand. So I say, okay, you know what, we can start adding more of a highlight over there. You can see that I was going over it a number of times, and it's a slow buildup that I'm realizing I'm able to do because of all of the highlight that's being added to the left hand side and the need to balance it. Now that I am at this point, I can move over to that right hand side and start building on it so that it does feel cohesive with what we've been doing. And I do start by working more so in that central area. I slowly move towards the right, still keeping openings and still for the most part building vertical pieces with diagonal leanings. So where on the left hand side, a lot of them kind of leaned in towards the left hand corner, on the right hand side they're leaning in towards the right hand corner, though I am trying to ensure that while I have this general movement, they aren't essentially symmetrical. I do want to ensure again that they are unique, that the viewer doesn't look at the painting and immediately understand everything that's going on. I want it to be continuously captivating, and that is only going to occur if you can continue to incorporate elements of visual surprise and just ensure that it is ever changing. It's not predictable. That said, I do go back in, add a little bit of an extra highlight into the areas that I really believe in, that I really like compositionally, and that definitely helps. However, we are still far from done, these stars, and there's just so much you can do with them in terms of technique. That said, we are going to move over to the smaller liner brush. This is great for rendering really, really tiny details. We're going to use quite a bit of our Mars Black, about half that, in our Ultramarine Blue. We use the smallest hint of titanium white, which, as you soon see, ends up being far too much. That does happen, and it's a friendly reminder not to just go with the first pigment you mix, but do mix until you get exactly what you want. So from there, I add in quite a bit of Mars Black and Blue just to balance it out. We have a good amount of pigment to play with here as well. So going into it, my brush is damp. I can render some nice, sharp, clean lines, and I start creating some divisions visually here in the stars. And I want these to be, again, also fairly randomized. However, moving up in the similar trajectories as our highlights, I am breaking apart different pieces that I feel may have become too large, that have, kind of created their own unintended entities. And so this is great for just kind of breaking things up. Though here, as you can see, I am now trying to blend the right-hand side of it out into the rest of our stars. I want one edge to be a bit sharper. I want one edge to be a bit more of that gradient, much like we did initially with the large vertical piece in the stars. And it's going to be kind of a commonality throughout the techniques up here, and something that will add to interesting form. I am going to have to go over a number of these applications numerous times because my brush is quite damp. I decided to make it as damp as I did because I wanted a very sharp, clean application, and water on the brush definitely does condense those bristles. It helps you move paint more easily, but it does thin it a lot. So we do this, and I also really like it because it gives me an opportunity to try things. Often my first application isn't that stark, and therefore if I don't want to commit to it, I don't really have to. It just gives me a little bit more leeway that I wouldn't have had otherwise if I went in with a pure thick pigment. So that much is appreciated. Here you can see that I'm also creating little pieces that exist within these darker, almost Fisher-like applications, and that is just another detail we can add to make it interesting. These also all don't have to be the same opacity. Some can be brighter, some can be darker, some can be semi-transparent, some can be, entirely thick, and playing with that is going to give you the most neat and captivating piece. So I'm going in and again continuing to separate the areas, the clusters, the clumps that I initially wanted separated but perhaps became a little too amalgamated through the layering process. And if you accidentally add too much of this, don't you worry about it, because it's very easy to go back in and add those stars. So do get playful, do try things out, and really have fun with the process because it really can be cathartic. Now here I'm using that same brush, quite a bit of water and just a little bit of paint to create little darker splotches throughout the stars as well. It's not something you have to do, but if things get a little too monotonous, it is an option for breaking up areas, not necessarily with line as I'm doing here, but with value, which is just one more additional resource in painting your stars. Though here things are starting to turn out okay, but we'll definitely need to add more stars later on. That said, here I am continuing to play with things. I also don't try to work on one area, finish it, and then move to the next. I bounce around a lot throughout this process, and I do so very purposefully so that if subconsciously I'm leaning towards a certain type of application, a certain type of rendering, I don't repeatedly do it in the same spot and make it really obvious. If you kind of bounce around and you accidentally do that, it's much more visually forgiving, and therefore I just try to move around as much as I can with that sort of technique while trying to continuously change all of our trajectories. That said, here I'm mixing up a very bright gray, and I'm actually going to tap in a lot of individual stars here with that liner brush. It essentially is the smallest head of any brush, with the exception of the individual bristles, which is how we applied it initially. But this is going to give us a lot more control. It's going to allow me to really illuminate the edges that are predominantly on the left-hand side of those darker applications. Again, I don't want both sides to be the same. I want the left-hand side to have more of a gradient. I want the right-hand side to just be sharp. And I am going to dabble a little bit on that side, but there are general rules. I'm also going to apply this in the center of the larger blue cluster. So if you ever see an area that has a lot of blue, it's brighter, and it just needs a little bit of diversity, and needs something to help it pop, this is what I go in and work with. So it serves a couple of different purposes. One is continuing to create those larger divides throughout clusters by adding it to the side. Again, that's touching that darker area. But then another is just brightening and adding sharp detail to the random other blue clusters that are out there, but not to such a great extent, because again, you do want the majority of your highlights and details to be in the center to really ensure that that's where the viewer's eye goes and stays. That said, we are going to now take a step back. That way we can see things in a bit more of a cohesive manner. Yet again, I am starting with quite a lot of titanium white. I'm grabbing quite a bit of blue. We're going for something on the brighter side for sure here. You can see grabbing even more titanium white, but never actually just using titanium white because, again, that's just far too great of an exposure and it doesn't give us any room to work with. It very much locks us in to a certain contrast, which again often looks like it's just too much. So with that here, now I'm peeling back the bristles on the very wet brush, and as you can see, I'm launching hundreds of little stars onto our canvas. And this is such a great technique. I used to essentially just do this for stars before I, really learned how to create all of the different clusters, the details, and make a lot of it more intentional. But now this is something I like to use as a finishing touch to really ensure that every area has a little bit of those minute applications. It's such a quick and easy way to do it. If you get really close to the canvas, you can kind of control how the paint flies at it, and it's just a really great technique to get a larger application. Obviously, a lot of it ended up going on the trees that we have on the path down below, but it's really no issue because we're going to be painting over that anyways. And after seeing all of those highlights spread out, I realized that, I do need to go back and reinvest in the important highlights because they lost a little bit of attention when everywhere else also got those nice little bright spots. So I went back in, I reincorporated that. It gave me more leeway to add more bright stars on the outskirts, which I am now doing via these taps. And you can see that these taps are actually rendering applications that are much larger than almost any other star that we have. It's our smallest brush. We're going in with a very fine tap, not applying much pressure because we don't want the bristles to expand, but it's still creating a relatively large application where the kind of rugged brush and all of its bristles created smaller ones, as did the liner brush when we peeled back the paint and launched it at the canvas. So recognize that you can create lots of different sizes of stars. That diversity is going to be great, but going in with just a tap is going to get you larger applications that you don't want through the entirety of it. That said, we are now moving down in the painting. However, we are moving into a similar subject. The piece here is hypothetically, in my mind, it's occurring after a rainstorm, and then all of the clouds cleared, so you have this beautiful sky. It's reflecting down on this very wet road, and so I want these open pools of water in the road, essentially, where tires have kind of taken out, pieces of that land. Now you have areas where the water can pool, and I want reflections of the stars in these pooled areas. So here I've drawn them all out with a little bit of Conte. That is spelled C-O-N-T-E if you would like to search it up, but it's essentially like a fine colored chalk, great for working on canvas because it doesn't generally dilute pigment. But here I'm just going in the same way I did with our initial stars, going in with a darker tapped base layer, something I can build on top of, and I do end up expanding those quite a bit. That said, I do wait for all of it to dry, that way I don't accidentally go in with a blend, and now we're going in with something that's going to be a little bit brighter than what we were previously working with. Again, we build it up very slowly over time, and at this point we've had some practice, so it just gets easier and more fun. Though, as you can see, I'm going with something that's slightly more saturated, and I'm doing that because often in the foreground you see more of the innate coloring of subjects, but you also see things with less atmospheric light, so you have more of a vibrant nature to that foreground, which is nice. It brings the eye in. It's very naturally a good thing, but I wanted to make this a little bit more blue, so this next layer that you saw me applying is a little bit less desaturated than what we were working with in the sky, because I do want the viewer's attention to be down here more, and it also just makes sense from a logical perspective. So with that, here going in and doing lots of those little taps, and it's again really funny to see just how rough everything looks. This should be a friendly reminder that if you are watching this video and you have not yet started the painting, this is how the stars do begin before we add in all of the layers, all of the detail, all of the different techniques, the breaks, and this is just part of the process. So you trust the process, and eventually you get to something that you really love. And we definitely do. So with that, here, again, adding slightly more titanium white. In this mixture, a little bit more of the ultramarine blue than we did in the past, so it is more saturated. Though, remember, the more titanium white or Mars black you add to a pigment, the less saturated it's going to be, the less vibrant it's going to be, essentially. So you do want to be careful with those when darkening and brightening, because it will have an impact. And here in an area where I want it to be more saturated, I'm going to be a lot more careful with that. I'm probably going to just use more of my blue, especially if it can already be relatively bright. So I like this a lot. We're going in, we're doing more of these little taps, and at this point I don't realize just how connected I want things to be, and I kind of recommend that you make them a little bit more connected. We'll have an opportunity to take out space and stars later on, or at least the reflection of them. So do feel free to make these a little bit larger than what you initially intend for them to be, and we'll talk about how we can kind of reduce the size and play with them a little bit later in the lesson. But right now we are essentially just doing everything star related, everything that we need to there. Then we'll move into the trees and all of the other really fun details and foliage, whatnot. But we are really solidifying the stars in this first half hour of the painting, and I think things are actually going really, really nicely. Jumping back into the 1/2-inch flat-headed brush, though I would like to note, I didn't really wait for that last application to dry, which is risky. It means that this new tap can blend with the old one, and it'll make a lot of the applications less sharp. So if you want to make it as sharp as you can, if you find that you're just kind of getting something muddy, you're not getting that very fine, detailed look, just let your previous layers dry before you go in with a new highlighted layer, and it'll actually make a really big difference. Easy to do. Again, acrylics dry generally within 10 minutes, so you also don't have to wait long. It's a good little reminder to go get a snack, go get a drink, stay hydrated, do all of those good things. It's so easy to forget when going through that painting process. I know I personally do all the time. So yeah, just take a little break if you need to, but also take a little break regardless, just to stay healthy. But with that, here we are back to the palette, grabbing quite a bit of a darker pigment, because yet again we need to create those little breaks within our stars, right? And this is something that can mirror what you have going on at the top. However, it's such a stretched reflection that you don't necessarily have to do that either. If you just get the general idea, it will look good. And we're going to have a lot of detail in this painting later on, so you don't have to worry too much about that, as there's going to be a lot visually to focus with. Now here I am kind of working my way either on the right or left hand side of these, just to create that slight little visual gradient. I'm also trying to create little darker areas amongst all of these bright highlights, and really just continue to diversify these as best I can. When we move into the foreground, we want things to be very sharp, we want things to be very detailed, and that's really what draws the viewer in, right? It is the start of this lane. So you do want to ensure that things, while they may not be a perfect reflection of the top, are in the very least well applied, thick layers of paint, nice build up, and I think we're doing a great job there. So with that, we're going to take a couple of steps back. Again, some things are best done, I think, visually up close, while others are best done farther away, because sometimes you do need to focus on the details, but other times you need to step back and realize if those details are actually aiding the painting or if they're just a little bit too much. That said, from a bit farther away, I think it becomes very evident that we have more room to play in terms of lighter values. So here I'm not taking a pure titanium white. There's a little bit of our blue in there. The brush itself does still have a little bit of gray on it. So it's not a perfect titanium white. If we wanted, we could go brighter. And here I'm just trying to find, again, the areas that seem more blue, seem more saturated, seem more bright and poppy, and I throw a couple of these stars in there. On the top of the sky, occasionally I will actively avoid those areas and go for a really dark area just so I have a lot of contrast and something different. But with that, we are switching to what is called the filbert brush, and this is great because it has rounded edges for nice blends, though I'm going to grab some of my sap green in equal mixture of our ultramarine blue, and then I double down on the ultramarine blue because while I want to create a green here, I want it to be significantly more of a bluey green in the background because we're going to have a lot of blue atmospheric reflective light. So there, I continuously add in the blue until it's about 3 to 4 parts blue to green, and then I'm adding in a little bit of titanium white and Mars black as well because I don't want it to be hyper saturated. But with this here, I'm essentially going to start sketching out where my background trees are going to be. We're going to have some in the background, some in the midground, some in the foreground, but we start in the back because we want to layer on top of it and just continue to move forward. So I kind of sketch out that bottom area to really define it, and now I work my way along that edge, not being too careful because realistically we don't have to. This is really just the base. But what we are looking for here in terms of hue and value is very much something in the middle of the road. I want it to not be the brightest highlight that we're going to incorporate in this background set of trees, but I also don't want it to be the darkest. We're looking for something very much, again, in the middle. So here I go with that. I work in that bottom area, and then I say, you know what? Time to work in the top a little bit. So I start to shape the top of my foliage with a lot of taps. I'm rotating my brush randomly but very frequently. That way we get the implication of a cluster of foliage at the top, different little branches and leaves moving out in different directions, just creating a lot of variance. And then once I have that top and that bottom area really finished, then I can start blending them in together. Though if the bottom area has already dried and you're having a hard time blending into it, you can go back to that bottom area, do a second layer, build up, or you can actually let it be a little bit more rough because this is the base layer of, in the very least, 3. We are going to cover the majority of it, and this is really just to give us, again, a good base layer for, you know, some of the highlights and whatnot to have kind of working around them to prove how bright they are, if that makes any sense. So with that, here we're going back in, and I love mixing smaller amounts of my pigments initially. That way I have opportunity to remix them and therefore really understand them, really internalize them, so that if I ever need to make them in a future piece, if I ever land on something that I love and I know that I'm going to want it again, mixing it a couple of times will really help you figure out exactly how you did that and ensure that in the future you'll be able to do that again because you didn't stumble upon the correct color. You actively articulated how to get there, and you did so multiple times, in turn, again, memorizing the process and creating something that's really going to stick with you. Now, in a lot of paintings, we opt for very smooth blends. Here, I want brush strokes. Here, I want texture. So I am being as loose with this as I can be. I'm not trying to smooth anything out. I'm working in a lot of obscure X-shaped patterns. I'm applying more pressure with my brush. And by the way, again, when you apply very little pressure with your brush, you get a very small marking. The bristles don't expand. Often it also isn't that opaque, but when you apply a lot of pressure, things get streaky. Applications can be very thick. Your applications are larger because the bristles are moving out. And I am definitely applying pressure through this first layer because I do want that very random element. Here you can see that the green even changes, but I ended up doing a little bit of a second layer there, let it dry, and now we're heading back up, just finishing that top area, which could be a little bit more blue as it is closer to the sky and all of that, blue light that's hypothetically be kind of reflecting downwards. We do want the majority of the background to be a lot more blue, and then we'll move our greens into actual green as we get closer and closer to us. It'll give the painting a lot more diversity, but again, it'll make sense because we won't see all of that reflective blue light in the foreground in the same way that we do in the background. But so far, so good, and we will get back a little bit closer in the painting. Now, for this next step here, we are going to start with quite a lot of Mars black, a little bit of our sap green, ultramarine blue, titanium white, and render a nice shadowy pigment which still encapsulates the general hues and atmosphere of the rest of the painting. So this is something that we're going to use to create a deeper inset shadow within our background trees. And once we have it all mixed with the filbert, we're going to switch back to the 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, which again has a bit more of a stiff bristle, and we're going to go in with a lot of a tap. Very, very similar to what we did in the sky previously. This is a fantastic technique which does span multiple subjects. It's something I like to use in trees and rocks, in stars. It's just so versatile, and I find the longer I spend with acrylic painting, now over a decade, the more I value this type of application, not for the final layers, not for the details and the true highlights, but for a lot of the texturing. And so this is going on in exactly the same way as the stars. It is with a very soft tap. We don't have a lot of paint on the brush. I'm rotating the brush in the air in between taps, and while I'm trying to cover the entirety of our backing foliage, I still want there to be openings. I still want that mid-value green to show through to establish depth, because none of this tapping texture will be noticeable if we do so much to the point where there isn't any contrast. It's the contrast that makes it notable. So I'm going in, I'm being relatively careful, but I am going over areas multiple times, building it up, creating different levels of those darker values, and really trying to create something interesting. This is essentially the deeper inset areas of all of this foliage that just can't receive any light. There is, again, so much light from this bright, beautiful sky at night that's coming down. It's creating this bluish green hue, but not every area of the trees is going to get that, and there's going to be a lot of openings within the trees where you can see these darker, deeper shadows. So that's what we're applying now. However, as you can see, very notably, it's going to look very rough, very messy for the next little while, at least until we have the first highlighted detailed layer on there. This is something that we're going to cover up for the most part. It's really just meant to be a base layer, a little bit of added detail and texture for later on, but it's an important step. And again, I'd implore you not to worry about the aesthetic at this point, because we're going to do so much to this area to make it look a whole lot better. Again, as you saw in the thumbnail of the actual painting lesson. So we will get there, but I am going over different areas once they've dried. I don't like to go over an area twice if it's still wet, just because then you start to move that paint around and actually blend it rather than get these sharp little applications. But once they have dried, I do go back in. With that, I am now switching back to the liner brush, grabbing quite a lot of our Mars black, our titanium white, our ultramarine blue. You can see that we are getting a nice, darker, cooler texture. And this is going to be just nice little details, essentially, for possible trees in the background. And I'm going to start painting some of the branches and the tree trunks now, because I want the highlights to go on top of them. That way they feel like they're in front of foliage, as you can see now, but also behind foliage. It'll make it look a lot more three-dimensional if we really play with it. So I want to start incorporating these, and we'll do more later, so don't overdo it. But we are just trying to get an idea of where we want things to be. I have very watery applications here. Again, as you can probably tell, they're quite semi-transparent here, and they are essentially that because we just have so much water on the brush. Though you could use more actual pigment, though it would definitely be more difficult to render the very sharp lines that we are, because remember that water does condense those bristles. It does make those sharper, more fine applications a lot easier to render. And I also like to note I am applying as little pressure as I possibly can as I get towards the tops of these branches, because the second I apply even the hint of too much, that really expands. And when it does, I don't want a top branch to be large, so I have to go back and make the bottom of that tree larger than it. And it's just kind of a process of going back and forth like that. So just something to consider throughout the process. But I'm now going to switch over to a fan brush with very stiff bristles like you can see here. This is going to be what we use for our highlights and our details in our top layers. So I start with quite a lot of titanium white, little hint of our Mars black, quite a bit of the ultramarine blue, and then about 1/3 that in our sap green, because the sap green's really quite strong in relation to the ultramarine blue. But I want a very bluish green for this first application, as this is the trees that are the farthest away and the ones that are, again, therefore going to have the most reflective light. Now, I'm not going to use the entirety of my brush. I'm going to essentially pick a side of it, and then I'm going to go in with this tapping motion. As you can see, it's quite similar to what we did with the 1/2 inch flat-headed brush. However, this time it's a bit more controlled. Our bristles are slightly more condensed, so we do have more clusters. It's going to create larger applications, but they're still going to be small and sporadic, at least in relation to what we were doing with the 1/2 inch brush. And I start on the top of our tree line and I slowly work my way down. I do that because the majority of the light is going to be touching the tops of the trees, and then it's going to naturally dissipate as we move downwards. So it just makes sense, as we will run out of paint as we do move with this brush. Though I am rotating the brush side to side if I do feel like I need new paint, and I'm really just kind of intuitively working around these, going over a lot of those drawn on or painted on, branches, things of that nature. But this really is a cathartic part of the process. I love it. I always have so much fun with this. And it's something that we can slowly build up on the top and make more and more sparse as we move towards the bottom. We can also build additional highlights on top of this a little bit later. So there's a lot we can do, and we are still just scratching the surface. Now, I guess I would also like to note that I'm not trying to go in with the same level of application there, the entirety of all of this. I am leaving some areas a bit more open because there are going to be different clusters in the tree. Some of them are going to be more thick, more dense. Others are going to be smaller. Some are going to be almost non-existent in different areas, and you're going to have the openings, and that's where you do see all of the texture, the darker markings that we worked so hard on. And so don't try to do essentially a wash, an entire covering of this highlight. You might love this highlight, but it only looks great because of that contrast. So do try to keep open areas and create different clusters, right? I also don't want to add too much highlight over to the left hand side. You can see that I'm getting even more delicate with my application. I just don't want it to be as bright and prominent, and that's very much because I do want the viewer's eye to be towards the center of the painting, and the brighter we make that left hand side, the more difficult it is to kind of control the eye from a subconscious level. That said, I feel like I can go back in and start thickening different areas. So we've created a, more nebulous application initially. Now it's time to go in and solidify different clusters, different portions of these trees, which are going to have more foliage. That is predominantly going to be at the top, but then I might move down and skip a little area. And you can see little bumps and movements that are occurring throughout it. That's really what we're building on. However, you don't have to overcommit to them at this point, because we can always go back in with even more of a highlight and continue to build that depth. Though you don't really want to overdo it in the background because, again, you want to save a lot of that range, a lot of that saturation, a lot of that heavy contrast for the foreground where you really want the viewer's eyes and attention. That said, I am going to go back to the palette. I am going to add a little bit of additional titanium white to our mixture, a little bit of green, a little bit of blue. Just try to create a brighter variant of what we just had. And we can't just make it brighter with titanium white because then we'll lose the saturation. So we have to balance it with more of the sap green and more of the ultramarine blue until we actually get what we want. But we are getting very close, and now I do go in for the test. Turns out I really love it. It's very close, but it is just a hint brighter, and as you can see, I'm going to use it predominantly on the top initially. As we move down and we run out of paint, we can kind of play with it more. But this is a great way of further diversifying what we have, and as we start to step back after this, you are really going to see how it's turning into real foliage and getting a very natural, real look to it. It took quite a bit. We had some really awkward layers, but it's with this layer where things do start to come together and look natural, despite the fact that we will do more with it in the very near future. And at this point, we are going to switch over to the 1/3 inch filbert brush because I do want to work with some level of detail, but I also want to pick up a fair amount of paint. And we are going to be moving forward in the canvas here. Now, I'm mixing up another mid-green. This one's going to be a little bit brighter and a little bit more saturated than our previous application because, again, we are moving forward. We're getting closer to that innate coloring, and that just means using a little bit more green in the mixture, maybe not working with any blue or very little blue like we did in the last iteration. But as you can see, I'm starting on the top of this larger area of foliage, and then I slowly work my way down. We have a bit of a leading line happening as you look at it from kind of this top area on the left hand side, then it moves down into the center of the painting. That's always great. It is another subconscious piece that does keep the viewer engaged. And now I'm sketching out the bottom, trying to create a little protruding piece as well because I want it to be much more natural. Having just a very straight line on the bottom would probably feel fairly artificial. So you want to interject these little pieces that one wouldn't expect. And from there, I'm going to mix up a slightly darker variant of it. You can see that we're working with a bit more Mars black, and that's because I'm moving towards the bottom portion, which is going to be receiving less light. So we're creating a bit of a gradient, but it's not perfect. It's not very smoothly blended, and again, that's intentional. With this initial application, pre-texture, pre-shadow, I still want lots of little movements and textures. That way, if any of it shows through a little bit later on, it has a lot more character and doesn't just look flat or, again, artificial. But with that, I am heading right back to the palette, now going for an even darker green, and we're going to layer on the base for our grass while we're at it. This can blend up into that larger area of foliage. You can see that I'm working a little bit with these X-shaped patterns, and as I move farther down, it'll probably become slightly more of a horizontal application because a lot of our little tufts of grass are going to be a bit more horizontal, but here you can get fairly creative with how you apply the paint because it won't matter all that much. Just ensure that this area, actually more than the earlier painted foliage, is a little bit more blended. We're just talking and giving a lot of praise to not blending much, but this is one area where you could blend a little bit more and it would probably be slightly more beneficial than it would be up higher. Every subject is different. You're going to want to think about why we're doing everything with every subject rather than just having surefire rules that we apply to multiple things, right? I think that all of those little unique decisions really add up. But here, yet again, we are back to the palette, mixing up a very dark green, but also semi-desaturated. We're still continuously adding in some titanium white because we don't ever want it to be too rich of a pigment. And with that, I am going back to that, 1/2 inch flat-headed brush we are doing the same tapping technique that we did in the tree above, but also in the sky. It's, again, just so versatile, so fantastic. It creates this subtle detail, and now we've had some time to take a break, to examine, to look at the line of trees in the background, and I love them. I think the foliage is fantastic. I think we need to interject some extra branches, some tree trunks, things of that nature, but we will be able to do that a little bit later in the painting. And as far as the foliage goes, I think that this technique is by far my favorite for rendering, again, foliage, trees, bushes at essentially this distance, anything that's relatively far away or really even in the midground. So here we're just going in with that tap, but when we get down towards the grass, things are going to start changing a little bit. Here it's all taps, we're not doing any drags up in that bush area. However, when we move towards the grass, we need to consider the way the grass is moving. And the fact is that it's a lot of little vertical motions, right? So going in with just a little tap, having dots, probably isn't actually the ideal kind of baseline pattern for our texture, and that's something you're want to consider. So here now I am going back in with that 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, and I'm doing a little bit of a drag. We're tapping it on, we're dragging it down, we're relieving pressure as we do that. That way it doesn't kind of have a larger bottom or a larger top. You essentially want to apply, if you're going to apply pressure, you essentially want to apply it in the middle of the stroke. So very little pressure when you touch the canvas, and then a bit more as you move through the motion, and then less as you finish the motion and move your brush up off of it. So I hope that makes sense, but it's all very subtle, though again, it's those subtle little pieces that really add up and end up making something special. So to kind of finish off this grass area, I'm going over a number of the open areas a couple of times, just making sure we don't have any missing pieces. And once that's done, I do switch over to the more stiff fan brush yet again, as it is time for some details. Now I'm grabbing quite a bit of titanium white, about an equal mixture of our sap green. Then I start with about 1/3 of our Mars black, but I quickly realize that it needs to be a whole lot darker. So then I go in with another 1/3 of that Mars black, a little bit of blue just to ensure that it is slightly more cohesive with those distant trees, because they do have quite a bit of blue in them. And then upon trying that, I figure, you know what? It's still fairly far away. It still shouldn't be this saturated, so we add in some additional titanium white to bring that saturation down. And after that, I'm actually quite happy with our pigment. So I start tapping that on, again, not using the entirety of the fan brush, really just picking little portions. However, our taps are changing slightly from our last application, in that I'm now going to apply slightly more pressure than I previously was. I want all of these protruding pieces of foliage to feel slightly larger because they are closer to us, and therefore my taps, my impressions, need to be slightly more prominent. We're making them more prominent through the saturation. We're making them more prominent through the fact that they are moving into more of a green than a blue, and we're also making them more prominent through the fact that we are adding pressure. Though we can also go over smaller areas and lower areas with less pressure to create something that's slightly more semi-transparent, more soft, just to give us that added texture to make it cohesive, but not so much that it's going to be distracting. And you do want the bottom portions of these larger clusters of foliage to be a bit more open and a bit darker. It's that gradient of light on the top moving down to the darker shadow that's going to make it look three-dimensional. And while we can have smaller areas that stick out and do catch light around that bottom portion, the majority of it does need to be darker. That way you do have that sense of depth. The light just can't wrap all the way around. It can't work its way through that thick foliage. And that's really the illusion of depth that we're working to get here. So lots of little taps at the bottom, slightly stronger taps at the top. And now we're going to start working on the base for some grass. So I'm just working vertically with my brush, creating all of these little tufts of grass in the background. You can leave some areas open, you can connect others, but the whole idea here is that we are just creating that base that we can build on. This isn't going to look perfect, this isn't going to look hyper stylish or beautiful initially, but it's going to give us something we can work with. I do want the edge that's closest to the road to be a bit brighter, so I like to start there, and then as I run out of paint I move towards the left hand side of the canvas, let it dissipate, let it get more scratchy and just not as pigmented, and that way it looks like that area is a bit darker. Perhaps it's being blocked a little bit by the larger bushes that we have right in front, and again, by having that middle area be brighter, we can ensure that the eye goes there. So now I'm going back in, I'm adding additional highlights to the tops of our grass, so just doing a second application. Not that complicated. Acrylics are semi-transparent, so when you go over them a second time, you get more of the color that's actually on your palette, where the first application is generally a combination of the color that's on the palette and the color that's already on the painting. Here in this case, black, because of the pre-painted areas. But with that, here I'm yet again going to go back to that palette. We're mixing up a bit more of a grayish green right now, as you can see, and this is going to be something that I want to go back and add in to the kind of larger areas of bushes, particularly on the tops, because I want more of a transition. I feel like the distant trees have this beautiful bluish gray glow to them, and then it's almost like a hard stop, and then we get our green, right? And the idea was always to create a transition, but I think things got a little bit too green too quickly, so we're just going to go back in to the tops of these. We're not going to work this highlight down too far, and we're slowly just going to interject something that makes it feel all a bit more natural. Though that said, I am going to go in later with a bit of a wash and connect all of it through very similar hues. So this can be done through a number of different methods, but I also wanted to change the value to be a little bit more similar, and I think that this is really adding a lot of volume. So very, very happy with that. Now back to the palette, and again with the smaller liner brush for some details. Now watch this. I love painting grass. I think it's so relaxing. I think it's so cathartic. You go in with the softest touch possible when you touch the canvas, then you apply slightly more pressure. It expands the bristles, it expands the stroke, you get a bit more of a thick body, and then you relieve pressure as you rip that brush off of the canvas, again getting smaller. So you have these blades of grass that have a lot of dimension. It's that middle section that is the most thick. The end should be nice and sharp. This is best achieved obviously when we have a fairly damp brush, as it will condense the bristles. It'll allow us to get the sharpest application possible, but you really you want to find that balance of wet to the point where you have all of this control, but not wet to the point where it's semi-transparent and essentially looks too thin to be natural. So that's something I am considering. The grass up close to us is much larger than the grass that you'll see in the distance, and I am going to progressively make it smaller as we move back there. I'm also jumping around quite a lot, as we talked about earlier. That way I don't kind of interject too much of the same technique into one singular area. I want that more randomized look to it. And here you can see we're adding some applications over into the left hand side, but not too many. We still want it to be darker. Now I'm back to the 1/3 inch filbert brush, and I have some burnt umber here on my palette for the first time, going in with half Mars black, half burnt umber, then about 1/5 titanium white. And with this, I'm going to put some nice little posts in, and this is going to be something which I feel gives it additional depth, gives it additional direction. We're going to connect all of these posts, and that's going to create leading lines, bring us in towards the middle of the painting. And the fact that they are going to be staggered, that they're going to get smaller as you move into the distance, is also going to articulate that depth. So they are going to serve quite a few purposes. I think that it's also just a nice aesthetic, a nice look. It makes the area look friendly, a place you could explore at night and feel safe. Just knowing that, it's not uncharted territory, right? So here, now I'm going to go into the farther area because I do want to establish essentially how large and how small things are, so I know how large the middle pieces can be. Okay, now I know that it can't be any larger than this, but I know it can't be any smaller than this. And so then I just find the 2 points in between. I work these two in, and of course this will all be in the traceable, so if you'd like to make the drawing process a little bit easier and just kind of handle all of that for you, you can find the traceable up over on Patreon. Normally I put the traceable and the reference photo up there, but I actually wasn't working from a reference photo really with this one. There was a fall reference photo that has the same composition, but the color palette and everything was much more just something I felt really inspired to do. But yeah, if you would like the traceable, that is linked in the video description. And with that, here I'm going in and doing a second layer on quite a lot of this just to ensure that it is nice and thick. The brush is relatively damp because I wanted nice sharp edges, but that did come at the cost of just not thick pigment. And now we are switching back to the smaller liner brush. You've seen this one quite a few times, but now we're going to use it to do some real detail. We have our burnt umber, we have an equal mixture of our titanium white, grabbing a little bit of our blue just to ensure that it's also a bit of a cooler brown, a bit of a cooler earthy tone, because we do have more of that blue light reflecting down on it. Then I'm going to make it a bit brighter with the titanium white, mix it in with the Mars black, and I do want something that is fairly desaturated for our first layer here. I do want something that, again, has the hint of blue, has the hint of that earthy value, but it is a little bit gray here, and it gives us a lot of room to build should we want to. But now I'm going in, I'm applying this predominantly to the right-hand side of every post, assuming that the majority of the light here is coming from the center, and so it's just hitting that right-hand side, and then it progressively moves towards the left, it dissipates, it's not noticeable, and then you have this nice contrast of the earthy highlight and then the very dark, very stark backing to the post. And right now, things are going to look a little rough. Like everything else, it's built up through layers. We will get there, don't get discouraged. And in the front here, I'm actually going to paint in the top of the post just because it's up close, it'll be noticeable. And so I'm working with a bit of that swirly motion, and now I move down the post. And I'd like to note, I move down the post through a series of strokes rather than a singular stroke because I do want there to be little divots, little texture. I want there to be very natural movements within that, and that's going to be best achieved through a series of applications rather than a singular one. It also gives you a little bit more control and ensures that you don't kind of swerve off into the grass, things like that. But then I do start to move towards the middle as the paint dissipates. I'm getting much more of a transparent application because there's now more water on the brush than there is paint, and I go back to a couple of the others with that technique, though they are getting quite full of pigment, and we may have to use other techniques to take away all of those more sturdy portions that should have more detail or more contrast. Now here, I'm going to brace my pinky finger on the bottom of my easel, and you can do this on any dry area of your canvas as well, but this is going to eliminate some shake when I go in for these very detailed highlights that we're working with now. This is going to be, again, in the spots that receive the most light, so predominantly on the right hand side, on the top if there is a flat top. Some of these are going to have it, some of them aren't, but I wanted to paint this from a bit of a distance so that you could see the contrast and value between it and the trees that we have in the background, as well as the highlights that we have more so in the reflections in the road. This is something that you want to rival those highlights, maybe not be quite as bright, maybe be close, but you do want this to pop a bit more, and that contrast between the darker side of the post and the lighter side of the post is going to be really, really gorgeous. This is also, again, our opportunity to add in that extra detail and separate some of those more blocky areas that just became a little too grayish brown a little too quickly. Though now that we've established the color and the value in relation to everything else, getting back really close and putting a lot of extra time and effort into the post which is closest to us, because it is larger. We are going to have an opportunity to see more detail and render more detail. So this one's a lot of fun to paint. That's generally how it works. The closer the subject is, the more texture, the more detail you can add, and the more fun you can have with it. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I do let it dissipate slightly as you move towards the bottom, because the top is going to receive slightly more light, but I really like how all of these are turning out. You can tell that they're a bit more unique. You can tell that the third one in has a little bit of a chip in the top. There's a little bit of a tooth-like effect, and that does, again, just make it more interesting. Now here we are going in with that same brush, some green however, and I'm layering some grass over top of these because we had to paint them on top of the grass, and it wouldn't make sense if grass didn't also overlap it. So it's a small detail, but it's going to add some nice depth. And my grass this time is a little bit more of a yellow, a little bit more of an olive, and so I decided to also work that into the background area a little bit, just so it feels nice and cohesive. So if the green colors ever change even slightly, I would kind of put it in a couple of different spots just so it feels natural in its setting. But once that's done, I am sticking with the same brush and I'm just putting the wire in between all of our little posts. This is done with quite a bit of Mars Black, maybe a hint of titanium white, maybe a hint of the ultramarine blue, because again, metal, reflective, it just kind of makes sense. But with that, I know I'm going to get comments about the fact that I've been talking for quite some time without taking a break. I always do. I have so much I want to say. There's so much information I want to pass on. I want to be able to teach you, and I know if I stop talking, I will miss things. So I know for some people they don't love the very continuous stream of conversation over a 2-hour duration, and I can respect that. But these really are meant to be lessons. They are meant to teach. They are meant to give you information, and as much good information as I possibly can. And I don't want to miss a thing. I don't want to kind of leave out anything important that could aid you on your creative endeavors. So I just thought I'd mention that because I've been reading quite a few comments about that lately, especially when I dub these. But just know the reason I don't stop talking is because I want the best for you, and I want the best for your pieces. So with that, getting back to talking, here still using that liner brush, mixing up some of that titanium white and maybe a little bit of our blue. Now we're going to go in and just add a slight highlight to the tops of some of the wire here, not adding it to all of it. You can see that I'm taking little breaks here and there. This is also a scenario where you might want to ground your hand using your pinky finger on a dry area of the canvas, but this application should be even smaller than that of the wire. You want the dark areas of the wire to show through on the bottom, and this is really just the areas that kind of stick up or face the light that is, again, for the most part, being emitted from that middle area. And in a scenario like this, the light is going to be less directional. We're making it slightly more surreal by giving very definitive, harder light and shadows. But it's an artistic liberty that I think is really going to aid the piece and the general aesthetic. That said, here I am now moving down into the road. I'm using the filbert brush. This one is again about 1/3 of an inch. I'm going in with a horizontal application, quite a bit of burnt umber, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, but not something too bright, something that we can add highlights to if we'd like. I'm working around a lot of the puddling areas, and there is one very specific technique which we'll talk about relatively soon, which will make all of this look a whole lot better, and especially the separation between the reflective watery areas and the ground. But for now, I'm just going in with these horizontal strokes, and I'm trying not to fill all of the negative space in the road. I'm trying to have some areas still be darker, and that way all of these brown applications, all of these earthy strokes look like they're protruding, like they're sticking up, and then when you have that little bit of darker road showing through still, that looks like a dip, a little divot where the light can't get. So it's a great opportunity and avenue to render, again, slightly more very subtle depth, though as you move farther and farther into the background, you can start to fill it in more and more, and you can see that I'm really doing that. I'm not taking as many little visual breaks with the road, and that's because you just won't see that level of detail that far away, so we might as well fill quite a bit of it in, and in general you want the majority of your detail to be in the foreground anyway. So do try to leave slightly more open spaces in the foreground and middle ground, and then progressively lessen how many there are as you move into the background, just filling them in, doing slightly more layers. And here you can see that we are finally starting to fill up this area. Looks rough, but so did literally every other piece of the painting in its first or second layer. So it's all part of the process, and you just need to trust it. And once you do this on a painting, once you do really all of these techniques on a painting, you can really visualize it and recognize the process for the future ones, and it isn't such a scary or apprehensive thing. So don't worry about that, and just go into it, feel confident, because I have no doubt that you can get it to a great place that you're proud of. But here, going in, just filling some of those darker divots with a very small amount of paint to just even it out. And now I'm switching back over to our smaller liner brush, going to make a bit of a highlight, just adding in some titanium white to our previous mixture. And now I'm going to find some of the areas that naturally look like they stick up. So areas that have a bit of a highlight, I'm finding the top of that stroke, and then I'm giving it a little bit of this drag motion. It's horizontal for the most part, but it also has little swerves, and I'm just trying to follow the natural markings that were made when I was doing the horizontal strokes in the areas that ended up being the brightest. So with this, I am also trying to do something very similar to the grass technique, in that when the brush touches the canvas, very little pressure, then I add slightly more, and then I relieve it as we get towards the end, occasionally doing a little bit of finger painting to soften the edges and whatnot. But this is a great technique to add in just a little bit more detail, and we are going to add a lot of detail to this area, between grass, between separation in the water and the actual ground. But here we are going to now go to that Mars black yet again. We'll grab some of that burnt umber, mix those two up, create something a bit darker, but I decided, you know what, let's go even darker yet again, and let's create some shadows for the ground here where it kind of sinks into the water. So hypothetically, these are two marks, two areas in the ground which have, continuously been eroded by vehicles and wheels. So they're much more inset. The water from the storm was able to, sink into these areas. You have these beautiful reflections in the sky. However, again, they are sunken in. So we have these darker edges to show that there's a bit of a shadow, there's a bit of a movement inwards. It makes it look a lot cleaner. It makes sense within the context of the painting. And I'm really only trying to do it with the areas, with the inset areas that are facing us. So anything that can be seen by looking directly into it, and that means for the most part I'm not really going to go over the top areas. It's more so the bottom. So here's a really good example of that on the left hand side here, just working on those bottom areas of those extensions and those protrusions. And I think that this is a really big step. You can spend a lot more time with it, you can make it look a lot more clean, but I really like that. And now I am heading back over into the grass. I'm trying to extend it out over the road because obviously we painted the road after the grass, meaning we had to cover up a little bit of said grass, and it doesn't make sense that the road would be on top of grass. So we're going back, we're adding grass, we are moving it quite dramatically over onto the road, giving it a really natural look, and I love this. Remember that when you get closer to us, the grass gets bigger. As we move farther away, the grass gets smaller, and this grass has a bit more saturation because it is closer to us. That is something I've been slowly building towards throughout this painting, and I decided that, you know what, the grass looks great on that side, but I want slightly more green in the middle. So I start adding in little pieces here and there. You can see that they're scattered, that they're following different trajectories. Some of them fall more than others. They're, on different angles, really trying to create that diversity and create different clusters. Sometimes there'll be 3 pieces of grass, sometimes there'll be 5, sometimes they'll overlap. Overlapping is really big. That's great for depth. But I do end up falling in love with this, and we do end up putting a little lane of grass that would hypothetically fit, under the vehicles in the center, really making it a beautiful, more so rustic looking road. But I also wanted to add some extra highlights to the grass kind of before we committed to that, just so I knew if it would be too much, because I knew that I wanted more highlights, but if the highlights really made the grass pop and overshadow everything else, then I wouldn't be able to do more grass in the center of the road. But because it all ends up looking really balanced, honestly, I am able to have some fun in just a minute. But there you go. It is definitely starting to progress. I think it's, getting out of that really awkward stage. It still has a little bit of a ways to go, admittedly, but we are moving in that direction, and it's just very encouraging. Here we're doing some much larger ones. Again, it's so much fun trying to overlap it, and with that, we can now move into that central spot. So this is something that I'm going to approach initially with not a wild amount of applications or blades. I'm going to try to stagger it because I'm not really sure how much I want to do, and if I kind of do quite a lot initially and then I want to walk it back, then unfortunately I'd have to repaint the ground as well as the highlights on the ground, as well probably as the shadows that are kind of connected to the reflections and the stars, and it would just be a lot of work to go back and fix. And we could do that. It's acrylics. We could do that probably in half an hour with dry times included. However, it can be avoided, so we're going to work to avoid it, and I'm going to do so here by essentially working in not a grand number of applications initially, and just slowly building them up, taking steps back, trying to articulate to myself if we need more, or if it's at a good place, which I think is one of those questions for many artists, which is quite difficult, and often I like to go slightly overboard, and that way I've seen it at too little, I've seen it at too much, and then I can just walk it back slightly. However, here I am just looking for that perfect number. So I go back and forth between some highlighted areas and some darker shadowy pieces as well. If we went all highlights, then unfortunately we just wouldn't have that same amount of depth, not all of the grass is going to be, the same value. It's not all going to be hitting light in the same way, and that variance is also going to allow the highlights to pop more than they would have otherwise, because the darker blades of grass are darker than the base layer that we're working on top of, which is the browns and the more earthy dirt values and hues. So with that, once I get something that I'm fairly happy with, I decide to go back to the larger, more stiff fan brush, and I work grass in over on the right hand side of the canvas. This is yet again done predominantly through just a myriad of vertical strokes. However, you can see that I'm also putting a little bit of a lean into it, trying to get it to move towards the road as we get towards the top. This creating more, little pieces of leading lines, trying to get the eye where we want it to be. And it's just such an easy, effective way of going about that. And I think it also looks quite a bit more natural than if we had all of the grass standing straight up. It's much like branches and foliage and all of these different things. You want these natural leans to kind of work their way in to kind of prove the more organic nature of it. But with that, as we get a little bit closer, I am going to extend my brush strokes so that they get a little bit longer, and we are just going to progressively build this up again. Going back over the tops of the blades of grass, if you can get your brush in that, semi correct space, is great, because then you are building lighter greens on top of lighter greens rather than lighter greens on top of essentially black, which again is just going to lead to a bit of a darker, bit of a more muted hue. So here we are just slowly building that up, and it is still going to look a bit more messy until we go in with the liner brush. And this is actually a great point in the painting to really talk about that, because we have one side of the painting which is done and which looks quite good, something that we can kind of compare and contrast with, and then we have this side which is in the early stages, and a friendly reminder that the early stages are a little bit rough, but that's okay. Now here I'm trying to keep the center, or at least the grass that's more so close to the road, a bit brighter, and then it dissipates as it moves closer to the right hand side of the canvas. So it's very much the opposite of the other side, and that again brings the eye in as it has the brighter area in the middle. But it also makes sense because we have these much larger trees right in front of this area, which are going to cast shadows down into this spot. So the closer they are to those trees and those bushes, the darker it's going to get, and it just makes sense within the context of our lighting scheme and the subjects we've chosen to work into the painting. But now, heading back into the grass with our small liner brush, trying to get all of this grass, again, you can see it crisscrossing. You can see that for the most part it bends in towards the road, but I do occasionally incorporate other pieces which go the other way just to make it look a little bit more natural and organic. So variance, as always, important, but I really do love how this builds up and makes it look just so much better. Though I would recommend when you're doing this, do take 5 or 6 steps back every 5-10 minutes. That way you ensure that no area of grass is getting overly complicated, or that the value is overly bright and therefore it just steals too much attention. That is something that can happen as we move into the foreground, and we just want to ensure that we are cognizant of that potential and continuously step back, because when you step back you get to see the painting in its entirety and you get to see it as a cohesive unit where everything either works together or it doesn't. And at that point, we go back to the canvas and we fix things, or we just progress. But so far, so good. I do like what we have going on. I do opt to mix an even brighter variant. So we have more titanium white. We have more of the green, and as you can see, that is extremely bright, so much so to the point where I feel like I need to work it in the middle and the other side to make it fit. And now we go in with something that's going to be a bit more pigmented but also slightly darker. The sap green has a darker value than the previously mixed pigment. So it is going to make said pigment darker, but at the same time, it's also going to interject color and hue into it, which is great and exactly what we want for the foreground. This is something we've been very hesitant to work in anywhere else because we wanted to save it. And again, because the background is going to have more of that reflective atmospheric blue light, and now that we're so close to this here, we get to see the actual colors of the grass again being illuminated by the light up in the sky and the stars, but certainly with more natural coloring. And I am trying to change the color of the grass here and there. I'm not going in with the exact same color every time. I do want more variance than that. And I think if you're not going to do things like flowers or little extra pieces that could interject form or color, then going with slightly different hues of grass, slightly different values, is actually, again, going to be very beneficial, though I would reserve the brightest values and the more saturated values for the areas that are much closer to us, like what we've been working on for a little while now. And here you can see I'm even going back over to the left hand side, just adding in different colors of our green. And we haven't really changed our green all that much. We haven't added in any other hues to it. We're just changing the amount of titanium white and Mars black, and that really can have a big impact on your mixes and all of that. It's so amazing how versatile all of these pigments are with just a little bit of white and black. But here, also now going back into the middle, ensuring that that is, working cohesively with everything else. And now that we have the grass overlapping both the ground and the reflections, I think that it's looking like that area is much more finished, much more professional. And I really, really love how this started to come together in these strokes in this section right here. It's just honestly so much fun. If you aren't painting along and you are watching it first and then you're going to go back and paint, I hope you enjoy that just as much as I did, because there's a very, very fun process. Now here I'm going back to the filbert brush, grabbing quite a lot of our Mars black, about an equal mixture of our sap green initially, a little bit of our titanium white, maybe about 3/6, yeah, about half. And then I do decide to add in some extra sap green to, restore that saturation. We are getting fairly close to us. This should be more saturated as a base layer than any of the other base layers that we've had in trees or in the bushes. So again, the closer we get, the more saturated it's going to get. It makes sense. I'm doing the edges first with this essentially vibrant and bright pigment. It isn't actually all that vibrant or bright, but it is in relation to everything else that we have in the painting. And that's always really important to remember, that, just because a pigment is darker on the palette or desaturated on the palette doesn't mean that it will be on your painting, and it's very much all relative. Now here I'm going in with a bit of a darker mixture. I want the right hand side of this area of foliage to be a lot darker, because the light is going to wrap around the top, it's going to wrap around what we see in the left side, but eventually it's going to dissipate, it's going to get darker, and that's exactly what we are working on here right now, though we are getting closer and closer to the foreground. So I'm going to continuously add more contrast, make it darker, make it more saturated, and here I think that the darker, almost black mixes are closer to black than they have been throughout the entirety of this. It's still not a pure black. It will not be a pure black, because we just want to have more range for value, in the same way that we're not using a pure white in the painting. So we are getting really close to that pigment, but we're not quite there, and I think that it's working out really, really well. Though I am doing little patches of the brighter green color, as you can see, just throughout. That's going to add, again, necessary diversity, and I think that it's going to look really, really nice. I also like to note, I really love the loose brush stroke effect we've been going with here. We're doing that so that we can build up texture, but I'd love to do a painting entirely in that technique. I know I personally love them visually, and perhaps that's something we'll do on the channel at some point. But this lesson is based off a lot of little taps, and it's been a lot of fun thus far. Though here we are going back to the palette and we are mixing a very, very dark green, quite a lot of Mars black, just a hint of the sap green, just a hint of the titanium white. And this is going to, of course, be for our second layer, which is done with the 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, stiff bristles, and just so many taps. Though, I would like to remind you, this will be best applied if your previous layer is entirely dry. That is when you're going to get all the sharpest little pieces, and we are in the foreground, so those two matter quite a bit. So just remember to let that base layer dry as best you can, and then we come back with this technique, which we are becoming incredibly familiar with throughout the lesson here. There's, I know, a lot of the same, but hopefully because of that you very much do retain it and you feel very confident with it and the technique at the end, and you know, it's something that you can incorporate in your pieces going forward, whether you're following a lesson or not, because it's just so unbelievably useful. I really want to do a lesson that has a lot of rock in it, because I think that it's really gorgeous, and that's an area I haven't found the inspiration yet, but I am working on it, and we will find something on the channel. So I guess this is a fun place to say, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. We do these lessons sometimes every week, sometimes every other week. Really depends on how complex the painting is, and if I've had to do the lesson multiple times in an attempt to make it as good as it can possibly be. I don't talk about it too much anymore, but there were a number of lessons where I actually did 4 times. I actually did the painting 4 times because I just, every time I did it, I was like, oh, but I could teach that a little bit better. Oh, but I could improve that a little bit here and there. And that does happen. Not to the extent of 4 times often, but I do try to, you know, make sure that these are great for you, that you're learning things, that you have fun with them, that they're diverse and neat for landscapes. Yeah, so if you are interested in more landscapes, more painting tutorials, do subscribe. But we're fairly deep into this lesson. So if you are here, I'd like to say a big thank you for just being here, being a part of the community, and you know, having fun, keeping traditional art alive. I very much love that. I very much appreciate that. And of course, I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody who is helping support the channel up over on Patreon. You guys, you keep the channel running. You ensure that I do have the time to make these, again, sometimes more than once, and you know, do the dub, do the voiceover, figure these out. This one was again based off a pre-existing composition, but I really had to think about the colors and what we were going to do, how we were going to change it. And I really love how it ended up turning out. And none of this could have happened without you. This lesson literally would not be up on YouTube, would not exist if it wasn't for you. And also, because of you, I do not have to run ads throughout the video. So if you've ever watched another 2-hour video on YouTube, you've probably seen like 18 ads through it. But hopefully through this, I don't think you should have seen one, with the exception of what ran right before the video. So again, to all of the patrons out there, thank you for making this happen. Thank you for making it so that I don't have to run just so many ads throughout the video, kind of disrupting the watching process. And again, just thank you for allowing me to make art and teach lessons for a living. I think that's incredible. If you are new to the channel and you're interested in supporting it, helping keep the lights on, just saying thank you. But you'd also like to get some really fun things in the process, you can sign up to Patreon. There's a link in the description up there. You can get the traceable to help you with the drawing process. A lot of people do that, especially for the slightly more complicated pieces like this. But you can also normally also get the reference photos. You can get access to all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. We talk about composition, we talk about doing things like glazing, we talk about, you know, how to blend different colors, different color palettes, what works really well together, what are complementary colors, what are, you know, all of these different options you have, what brushes should you be using, should you be, you know, working with water, what are the effects, all of that good stuff. You know, you can check that out. But there are also a bunch of ebooks full of traceables for those days where, you know, you want to make something, but you're not entirely sure what you want to make. So we have a lot of fun stuff up there. We also have a private Facebook group you can get access to where everybody shares their work. It's a really cool collection of renderings based off of similar lessons. You get to see how other people are making changes and, you know, what you can kind of pick up information wise. It's a great community, but I'd recommend it if you'd really like to dive into acrylic painting. But also, if you don't have the time, if you don't have the income, you know what? It's okay. Don't worry about it. We have a fantastic community that does support the channel, and I'm really grateful that you're here regardless, and we're just going through this painting endeavor together. Now, I've been talking about a number of things for a while, so we're going to get back to the actual painting lesson. And here you can see that I'm using the filbert brush, using quite a lot of Mars black paint, little bit of our burnt umber, and I'm creating the first application for our tree trunk and some larger branches as well. Now, this is something that I like to initially create as a much smaller application. I want room to grow. It's much easier to make the branches larger than it is to make them smaller. So I am starting with a relatively small set of branches and tree trunks, and you'll see as we continue, it will certainly expand. I'd also like to note I'm not going straight up with my tree. I'm trying to have it break apart into multiple sections. I'm trying to have them overlap and kind of weave back and forth. I'm also not making one singular line in the process. I'm trying to connect it through a series of miniature strokes. That way you have all of these neat little bends and twerks, little tweaking effects, and I love that. I think that all of those things make your trees look so much more natural and original, and I'm really trying to emphasize that in this one here. Though you'll notice that the tree looks very barren, and it is going to until we switch to a different brush and we create a lot of smaller branches. It is going to until we incorporate lots of foliage. Those are things we are going to do. Do not worry. We're also going to create some added depth in the actual tree. So there is a lot to have fun with, and it is just getting started like every other subject in its initial base layers. Though I am using quite a bit of water because I do want very sharp edges for this. We are on the foreground. They are important. You could even switch to a half inch or a quarter inch flat-headed brush, as that has a really sharp edge. But I found that the filbert worked quite well here, and I'm still just kind of trying to elaborate on the branches, go back over previous ones once they've dried to thicken up that pigment to make up for the amount of water that we have in there. But here you can see up top the branches are starting to cross one another, and that is something we really do want to focus on. And, you know, just going in at the top here with as little pressure as possible to deliver the smallest little markings. So now we're going to switch back to the smaller liner brush. We are going to mix more of that burnt umber Mars black with just the smallest hint of titanium white. And here we are going to start creating the really tiny, nice little branches, while also going back over the larger branches at the top. I noted that I did the tree trunk again, and, you know, we go back and we do those secondary layers. However, going back and doing the top branches a second time with the filbert brush is really risky. It has a bit of a larger head to it, and if you want to ensure that those top branches do stay small the way we all generally intend for them to be, then you do probably want to go in with a smaller brush like this. That way you can be a little bit more tactful with your applications, and I definitely feel like things are working out. Here I'm focusing on moving a lot of branches on top of other branches. That way it looks like they kind of weave in front of and behind the other, areas, it definitely does create additional depth, even though at this point we are essentially just painting with a silhouette. There isn't any additional gradient to it. There isn't any light moving around it. At this point, it is just very simple, and that's okay because, again, we have everything moving around. I'd also like to note that the branches I'm currently painting move back down. It's good to note that while a lot of branches move upwards, and that's how they grow, sometimes they get a little bit too heavy and they do start to dip back down, and those are generally great to paint in around the tops of your canvas because it creates a little bit of a framing effect, and it can be just this nice little accent to ensure that the viewer does stay in the canvas, as those are generally going to be darker than the sky, which you don't want to be the brightest area because, again, that's where the viewer's eye goes. So there are a couple of different reasons you do that. Again, composition, leading the eye, but it's a great little technique. And with that, we are going to take that same brush, that same general application, and start working on a smaller tree down towards the base area here. And I'm doing this to add a little bit of diversity, to add a little bit of a lead in towards the center of the canvas. I didn't want to essentially just do one large tree trunk because it would look a little off. It would look a little cartoony. I think that often when we paint nature, if we paint a singular subject and we keep it there alone, it's something that looks a little bit out of place. So even if you don't want to do a large tree, which would be understandable, we only have so much space to work with, we've already planned out the composition, doing a smaller tree like what I'm doing here is a great way of noting that there are multiple trees and it's not something random. It's not something that's specifically placed there because we think it looks good. It is placed there because we think it looks good, but by adding the other trees, it's a bit less obvious and a bit more natural. So it's definitely something I like to work in. I did this in the fall version as well, and I think that it's a great little addition to the bottom of the painting. Though we are now going to continue, and this is a technique you are more than welcome to incorporate. I end up doing something different a little bit later in the painting, but I thought it was worth showing you both versions because you do have some option here. Now I'm taking this very desaturated brown, and with a series of taps I'm working around the edges of the tree which are facing the middle of the painting. Again, we're exaggerating the light that is coming from that middle section, but we're doing so, and I think that it's an artistic liberty which really adds to the aesthetic of the piece, and you are more than welcome to take those artistic liberties and have fun. But here I'm trying to create some added texture in the tree, so I also move in a little bit. That way it looks like some portions are protruding, they're catching light. You can occasionally see little knots in the tree, but that is one technique we can do. I do end up making these into birch trees later on. So completely different technique, but I wanted to keep this footage in here as well because you might not want birch trees. You might want trees like this. You might want them to be a bit darker, which these certainly are right now in comparison to what they become. So recognize that you have some option and that this opportunity here really isn't that difficult. Here again, just moving in slightly, but not covering all of the darker area on the left-hand side. We kind of skip a little spot and then we go in and we add that highlight so that we again have those nice little weaves and darker areas. But now I'm going to switch over to the fan brush and dip it in a little bit of water. Here you can see it's started to separate, and this fan brush is a lot softer than the previous one. The other one had very hard bristles, where this one, they again are more soft, so they tended to clump more, which makes the applications they create larger, where the previous ones were very sharp and fine. So different types of fan brushes will render different results, and you don't need to use it. I'll show you how we can go about making the foliage larger through a different technique after, but this is a good thing to learn. So here I'm going ahead and I'm mixing a brighter saturated green honestly the brightest and most saturated green which we've worked with yet, because we are so far now in the foreground. We are really going to see those natural greens. And so I mix that up with the filbert brush because it's great for mixing paint. But then I switch over to that fan brush, that soft fan brush, and I go in with a tapping motion around the ends of my branches to create some smaller leaves kind of in the distant areas of these trees. And this is semi-randomized. As you can see, I don't have worlds of control, but I do have some depending upon how I rotate my brush, and this is how I want to begin because it gives me a decent start to figuring out where all of our foliage is going to be. I'm going to cover some of the branches, I'm going to work around others. Again, you want a nice balance of the two, but I'm also pressing my brush into the canvas significantly more than when I was with the stiff brush, because I want my bristles to expand a little bit and I want these slightly larger markings because this foliage is a lot closer to us. But now, here I'm going to do quite a few of these individual leaves using the filbert brush. So I go in with a bit of pressure, so I get a bit of a rounded base to the leaf, and then I drag it. As I drag it, I relieve pressure, so then I get a bit more of a sharper tip. And it's a wonderful, very easy technique that does create the aesthetic of all of these leaves. I'm trying to, again, jump around quite a lot. That way we do have that nice diversity. And I'm also going to create clusters where it's going to look initially like we lose all of our depth because it's all the same value stacked on top of itself. You don't really have the illusion of shadow and highlight, but we will add that on in a little bit. This isn't the final layer of leaves, so don't worry about that. But here, leaving little openings and starting to make it a bit more full as we move towards that right-hand side, because I'm going to want to make that a bit darker and silhouette it, and I'm going to want to do so through foliage. But I need a brighter base layer because the light that's coming through is going to illuminate the leaves that are closest to the sky, and then we'll paint on the ones that are closest to us in the additional layers quite soon. So we need to paint on this brighter area of foliage. Again, doing a lot of it over to that top right. I'm going to leave a bit more of an open section as well. That way it doesn't look too overdone or kind of clogged. I do want areas in which it can breathe, and it's important to note that trees don't always grow perfectly, right? They grow out in nature, and storms happen and different wildlife lives in them, and it's important to remember that you're not going to have this perfect trajectory and amalgamation, this sorting of foliage. So I do try to leave areas open in unpredictable manners, and I think that does help a lot. Here, trying to work foliage both behind and in front of the tree. We did that with the fan brush, but we're also doing that here with the filbert brush. And I do think that this is working out, but I don't want to go too low with this either, because I do think there's a point where these branches with leaves should essentially stop, and you are essentially seeing where that is. So with this, I'm now going back over some of the older applications, making them a bit more thick because we are using a little bit of water just to ensure that those edges are nice and sharp, and that is requiring additional layers. But with that, I am now going to have some fun with darker foliage. So I added a little bit of Mars Black to our mixture. You can tell it's not significantly darker with that first application, but we'll darken it yet again. And I am starting in the top right-hand corner because I do want the corners, for the most part, to be a little bit darker at the top to, again, keep the eye in the brighter portions of the painting. So I do go for a bit of a vignetted effect. However, it's not the traditional gradient of a vignette. It's a vignette done through subject and through value, despite the fact that there is definitive shape and line. So it's a bit different, but it looks much more natural than an actual vignette would look. And again, it's just another technique to subconsciously keep the viewer in the painting. I feel like that's been a really big theme throughout this piece, and that's often something that comes up when you have a lot of subjects, because There's just so much to consider, and they all should play into the larger compositional ideas. But here we are applying this on top of a lot of the greens, particularly in the areas that got very blocky, that you had essentially no depth in because there were just too many. But now we are building on that depth. Now we have those layers of foliage. Now we have something that looks already a lot more natural. And these layers are also a little bit thin, admittedly. I will need to go back and thicken up quite a few of them, just ensure that it's nice and opaque. But also, it's another area that will definitely benefit from the base layer being fully dry. So do try to keep that in the back of your mind. And for the most part, unless you're doing a smooth blend or the choppy blend that we were doing for the base layer of a lot of the bushes and trees, letting your acrylics dry before you go in with your next layer is often a really good technique and something that's going to keep your paintings looking a lot more professional. It takes more time, obviously, but not a significant amount because, again, acrylics are just so friendly. They dry so fast, and they're very, very convenient. So yeah, just something to keep in the back of your head if you're ever having trouble with making a certain application look really sharp or capturing the proper hue. Now, from there, we are going to get quite close. I'm using that smaller liner brush, going back to the green that we used for the base layer of our foliage, adding in some additional titanium white, and now, as you can see, I'm adding some highlights to each individual little leaf. I'm predominantly doing it to the end of them, the area that could catch more light that does stick out from the rest, but I'm also occasionally wrapping it around the top of the leaf, and this is a rather time-consuming process. You don't need to do as much of the highlight as I'm doing here, but I love the way the green looks. I'm a big fan of green and just that very natural color. However, it really is worth noting that if you wanted the sky to pop significantly more, all of the blues, all of the stars, make this area a bit darker, a bit more silhouetted, and it will come out. I wanted that balance. I wanted both to really have a place in this painting, and I didn't want to sacrifice one to the other, so I did go for a bit of a brighter green, and I'm glad that I did. But recognize that if you love the starry sky that you have and you really want to accentuate that, going with a darker tree, darker foliage, that's really going to help aid you in that area. Again, this lesson and really all of mine are, while they're meant to guide you along the path of creating the painting that we're creating in that moment, also giving you ideas on how you can move away from what I'm doing and kind of work into your own ideas, because I always want you to feel comfortable making the piece that you want to make, the piece that you feel inspired by. And again, if you like to play with the trees, maybe even the season here, there's so much you can do, and please feel welcome to do all of that. Here, I am going over some of the leaves. We have a lot of the leaves layered now on top of the branches, so I'm kind of ensuring that the branches weave behind but also in front, having a lot of fun with that same smaller brush. Though you can tell that the applications are quite watery, they're quite semi-transparent. I will need to go back and thicken all of these, but that really is just part of the process. And in 2 minutes, once it's dry, we will be able to go back and do that. So at this point, all is well. I'm also creating some little branches that don't necessarily have leaves at the end. You can do that. I think that's a nice little touch. I don't do too many of them, but I do like to incorporate a couple, and I think that, again, it also makes it look more natural, because not every branch is going to end with a leaf on it, and that's important to remember when we're working on these paintings too. So now I'm going to switch to the 1-inch flat-headed brush. We haven't used this in quite some time, but I want to create a bit of a wash. So I'm getting a very watery brush. I'm grabbing a lot of our sap green, very small amount of our Mars black, and I'm also going to grab a very small amount of our titanium white. But I need a tiny amount of those because they're very thick and I need this pigment to be incredibly thin. I'm simply using them to desaturate my green, but once I have this very watered down pigment that won't change any of the line work, as you can see, I'm just moving over portions of that background because as I continued the painting, I realized that I didn't want these trees to be that far away, and I wanted to move them a little bit closer. And when they move closer to us, they have more green in them, right? They have less of that reflective blue light. So I left the tops of them a little bit more blue, but I do go back in a couple of times, add in this green. And this green is going to unify a lot of our different subjects. We kind of broke up different portions of our painting, right? We worked on the background trees and the midground trees and the foreground trees. And if you go over most of it with a glaze and the same mix for the glaze, it's going to bring everything together. And this isn't something you have to do. This is only something that you do if you want to, again, change the hue of your background or make things a bit more cohesive. But you could also do this with blues and make your background and your midground even more blue than they were. You have a lot of option, and again, it very much depends on what you want to accentuate in your piece. Again, I love the greens. I wanted more green in my painting, but if you really love the blues in your sky, then through this process you might want to make your trees a little bit more blue and have them accentuate that. So lots of different option, but just make sure that your base layer is fully dry when you go in to do that, and just have some fun. That said, here I am now back to the smaller liner brush. We have our titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, and I'm going to paint in a birch tree in the distance. I noted a little while ago, quite a while ago admittedly at this point, that I wanted to interject some additional branches, some additional pieces of trees in these. I felt like we lost a lot of it in the background, so I'm going to rework this back in, and I really like the added detail, especially with this birch tree. We'll go in with some darker trees too, but at this point I definitely think it was the right call. Now, I think it's also worth noting, as I look back on the footage, the colors and the hues in the background look a little bit splotchy. Some areas look a little bit more high contrast, some look a little bit softer. That's just because that background is still rather wet in different areas, and so some of them are more reflective, and those more reflective areas have a higher contrast because they are wet. So don't worry about that. That will dry and it will look much more natural relatively soon, and I can assure you of that because at the time of recording this, it has been dry for quite some time. Though here I am again weaving in between different clusters of foliage to create some of these more distant trees. You might not want to go in with a hyper dark pigment. You might want to go with a darker grade. That way it rather feels quite a bit farther away. Again, I decided to move it a little bit closer to us, so I went with a bit more of a stark pigment. But do recognize that if you wanted to remain farther away, then you're going to want to go in with something with a bit more titanium white in it, maybe a little bit more blue as well, maybe a little bit more burnt umber. But I really like this. Again, creating trees in different clusters, having some that are standalone. None of them are standing perfectly straight up. I do have them all on slight angles that are always different from the one next to them, and we also have some connecting branches that are of course going to kind of move over top one another. So different collection of trees and movements in the background, different actual types of trees because of the birch, and then I'm also going to incorporate a couple branches here in the midground too. And I think this is such an important touch. So often a painting comes together in that final 10 to 15%, and this is really that starting to occur. It's this added detail which just makes it look so much more natural, and I really love it. But I would recommend doing it with the smallest brush you have. Go in with some water, redo applications if they're too thin, and just kind of jump around so that you don't accidentally do too much in one particular area. But with that, I'm a big fan of that bottom spot. Decided to go up to the top and add a couple more really tiny applications. And now we can move on to the next step, which involves the filbert brush. This one, again, 1/3 of an inch. We have quite a lot of titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of our ultramarine blue. And here I'm going to turn this into a birch tree. Now, my hand is admittedly in the way. Apologies, I will fix that relatively soon. But here I'm just going in with a little bit of a tap on the edge. I do the tap and then I move the brush. I do the tap, I move the brush. And now I'm just kind of dragging that paint backwards a little bit, which is giving us a light that moves around it. It creates a little bit of depth, though we definitely need to do significantly more. So I'm going to create a bit of a darker gray now, something that's in between what we just applied and the darker back of the tree. And here I'll apply that more so in the middle, and we'll leave the back to be quite dark because it is on the opposite side of the light. And this is a different option that you have instead of the more linear applications with the earthy burnt umber that we used earlier. Again, different types of trees, depends on what you want to accentuate. If you want your painting to be quite dark, or rather the sky to show, then you do probably want to go with more of the earthy application. But if you are going more of the green route, then this is a really beautiful thing to add. So here, going in, doing a couple of layers, apply it to that edge through a tap, drag it back, until it dissipates, and go in with very limited amounts of pressure. I'm also going to start moving up the smaller areas as well, and just building on what we've established. Every time we go back in and we add a layer, it gets brighter and brighter. I'm not changing the mixture, I'm not changing the pigment, it's just that we're adding light pigment on top of light pigment rather than light pigment on top of dark pigment, because acrylic paints are thin and we will see that base layer through it. Though I am very quickly realizing that brush is far too big to work on this tiny little tree, so I do decide to switch back to the liner brush, which is something we'll also have to do for all of the branches at the top. But here I'm following the exact same rule. I'm looking for surface area that is facing the light, area that is facing upwards, or area that is facing towards the left. So we have a couple of different options, a couple of different rules to work with, and this is something that I do want to remain very small. So I'm going in and working directly on top of these areas. I'm not expanding, I'm not applying this right beside our initial application. It is on top so that it remains nice and small, because we do want this to be a tiny tree, very much in relation to what we are working on towards the right. And once that's done, we can of course head up in the painting. I'm going to redo a lot of the markings that we did with the brown, and I'm doing this generally with lots of little taps and drags rather than the longer ones, because it is just going to look more natural. And I find with birch trees, it looks so much better when it is a bit more rugged of an application. So that is something I'm trying to keep in mind. Though when we get to the really tiny branches, that is where you can go with the longer applications, because you don't want to kind of accidentally risk it getting too large, or kind of missing the connection point and then having to make it larger in the process. So your application process does and should change depending upon what area of the subject you're working on, and that's already notable because we moved from the filbert brush to the smaller liner brush. But it really is incredible just how versatile these brushes are. We've used them for so many different subjects in this painting, and here they are 2 hours in, still proving just so much valuable worth. So you really have to love it. And now we are working on these outstretched areas. Again, I really, really like the greens with these highlights, though, and I think I've covered this, but I want to repeat it. If you want the sky to be brighter, don't add in all of this bright highlight on the branches. Now, taking a step back, I turned on the light so that we have very good lighting, and I think that it's all meshing so well. I'm going to take my smaller brush and just tap in some of our stars. Now that we have all of our greenery in our foreground implemented, I have a much better idea of how much detail we can have in the background, something I was hesitant on kind of jumping into initially because I just didn't want to overdo it. But again, now that we know, I can go back in, I can apply these extra stars. You can tell that they're actually quite large in comparison to our other applications because we are using multiple bristles to make this marking. But that's actually quite nice because we do want to finalize the stars with something a bit more notable, and I think that was definitely the play. Though you can always go back in and add more with a smaller, more fine brush, right? So using something like the 1/2 inch flat-headed brush that we used with all of the little bristles. Though here I'm going in with another glaze. This time it's predominantly a blue, little bit of titanium white, little bit of the Mars black, and I wanted a bit of a green blue here in the distance. I know I'm kind of going back and forth in this area, but you can do that. You can have fun with it, and in the process of adding multiple glazes, you essentially combine the values, right? We make probably the brighter values a little bit darker, make the darker values a little bit brighter. So it unifies things in a really neat way, and it now makes this area as a whole a lot more less contrast heavy, which is great for the mid to background, where the foreground can have that heavier contrast, and it pushes it farther back, it gives it more depth, and it unifies things in an interesting way. But with that, that is essentially our painting. I hope you feel like you learned a lot. I hope you feel like you enjoyed the process and you're excited to go out and make something that's your own. Feel free to follow the painting every step, but also feel free to take artistic liberties and just have fun with it. I had such a great time working on this. It really was a pleasure, and I really look forward to our next lesson. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community. Again, big thank you to everybody who is up over on Patreon actually making these lessons happen. If you'd like the traceable, you can find it up over on there. If you'd like the ebooks or access to the exclusive Facebook group, any of that fun stuff, again, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. But, regardless of if you can support the channel there or not, thank you. I had a lovely time. I hope you have a lovely time, and I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson. So, above all, as always, stay creative.